Pursuant to House rules, some members will appear in person and others will appear remotely via Zoom. For members appearing remotely, I know you're all familiar with Zoom by now, but let me remind everyone of a few points. First, the House rules require that we see you, so please have your cameras turned on at all times. Second, if you want to be recognized outside of regular order, you may identify that in several ways. You may use the chat function to send a request, you may send an email to the majority staff, or you may unmute your mic to seek recognition. If you intend to offer an amendment, we will need to distribute it to all members electronically. We will give priority of consideration to amendments that have been filed in advance of the markup. We have asked in the markup notice and memo that members who want to file amendments submit them to the email address in the committee's notice 24 hours before the markup. We have distributed all of the amendments that we have received. Roll call votes will be postponed and the time will be announced in advance. We will begin the markup in just a moment when they tell me that they are ready to begin the live stream. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 4125, the Keep the Watchdogs Running Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 4125 to authorize inspectors general to continue operations during a lapse in appropriations and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4125 offered by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this markup. And thanks for bringing H.R. 4125, the bipartisan Keep the Watchdog Running Act, to markup. Inspectors General play a critical role in promoting accountability in the federal government operations, rooting out fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. Potential savings from audits and investigations conducted by the offices of Inspectors General in fiscal year 2020 yielded a return on investment of $17 for every $1 spent on the OIG. Unfortunately, lapses in appropriations can prevent OIGs from performing this important oversight work because absent approved appropriations, government agencies, including OIGs, must generally shut down operations and furlough employees. Many mission-critical agencies, contractors, grantees, and other program participants, however, continue certain activities even during such lapses. Without sufficient authority to operate, OIGs cannot carry out timely oversight of their government operations during shutdowns, leaving agencies vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse. For example, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the U.S. Postal Service are funded independently of the appropriations process here in Congress and continue to operate during government shutdowns, but because their OIGs are funded by annual appropriations, they are subject to shutdowns, while the agencies they oversee continue to operate. Similarly, agencies such as Social Security Administration and the Internal Revenue Service continue to make mandatory payments that are not subject to appropriations, but their OIGs are limited by the absence of appropriations during a shutdown. The Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice continue much of their activities during government shutdowns pursuant to emergency exceptions for public safety and law enforcement operations, but such exceptions are not necessarily available for the OIG, who is charged with overseeing those operations. This bill corrects those discrepancies. The Keep the Watchdogs Running Act implements a priority recommendation of the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, CIGI, and grants OIGs authority to continue oversight of agency operations even during lapses in appropriations. Specifically, the bill amends the Inspectors General Act of 1978 to authorize Inspectors General to continue operations as if functioning under a continuing resolution during a lapse in appropriations to the extent necessary to oversee their agency operations that continue during an appropriations lapse. This authority would be in addition to any existing funding authority, so OIGs would also use available multi-year appropriations or emergency exceptions for protection of life and property, if applicable, to continue operations during a lapse in appropriations. I'm very pleased, and I want to thank my ranking member, Mr. House of Georgia, for his co-sponsorship and his cooperation in this, on this, I think, important gap-filling bill. That's another example of good government legislation coming out of our subcommittee and this full committee, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Heiss, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I likewise want to echo Subcommittee Chairman Conley. Thank you for the opportunity to work together with you on this. And I just echo some of your comments. The Inspector Generals play a vital role in promoting accountability in government operations. As we all know, what they do in investigating waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and the like. Their duties extend to overseeing the use of taxpayer funds through a variety of government programs. However, during a government shutdown, when tax dollars are still being spent across the government, nearly all inspectors general offices are closed. As a result, and just think of that, when they're closed, the result is that they are not at work, even though hundreds of millions of tax dollars are still going out the door, even during a shutdown. From December 22nd, 2018 through January 25th, 2019, we saw a government shutdown for 35 days. Without sufficient authority to operate during these shutdowns, inspectors general cannot carry out timely oversight of these government operations, and of course that results in significant backlogs, among other things. This legislation would ensure that all agency IGs are able to continue conducting robust oversight during lapses in appropriation to ensure that tax dollars are being spent properly. I certainly understand some concerns that enabling inspectors general to work during lapses in appropriations may seem to further erode Congress's power of the purse, but I believe the oversight and investigative work that they do on behalf of the American people is vital, even during times when there is a shutdown. So again, I want to thank my colleague, Subcommittee Chairman Jerry Conley, for working with me on this legislation. I also want to acknowledge the bipartisan work of Senators Tom Carper and Mike Braun, who are leading a companion piece of legislation. The Keep the Watchdogs Running Act illustrates the important work that we can do to help empower inspectors general oversight when we work together on smart bipartisan reforms. And so again, I thank the subcommittee chair, and I thank you, Chairwoman, for prioritizing this legislation today, and I certainly urge my colleagues to vote yes. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I thank the chair and ranking member of the Government Operations Subcommittee for introducing this bipartisan common sense measure. The bill will allow inspectors general to continue operating when there is a government shutdown. It would do so in a carefully crafted manner by allowing them to continue oversight only of those programs that also continue to operate during a shutdown for health, safety, or national security reasons. This has been a long-standing priority for IGs and would improve accountability of government agencies during a lapse in appropriations. I urge members to support this measure, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from New York. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting 4125 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. I now call up 1508, the Guidance Clarity Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 1508 to require guidance clarity statement on certain agency guidance and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1508, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purpose of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the amendment. The Guidance Clarity Act would require federal agencies to include a guidance clarity statement on the first page of guidance documents. Federal rules, regulations, and guidance are complex, even at the best of times. For most Americans who do not spend hours per day reading through federal regulations and guidance, the intended use and authority of the materials surrounding federal regulations can be confusing. This simple, good government bill will help clarify for the public that agency guidance is intended to help guide the implementation of federal regulations, not act as additional legally binding rules. This is a bipartisan bill in both the House and the Senate, which just last week passed a Senate companion out of committee by voice vote. I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for bringing this bill up for a markup and for this amendment, which I fully support. The committee has led efforts for several Congresses to enact the Guidance Clarity Act. And just last week, our counterpart committee in the Senate favorably reported compromise bill text, which this amendment fully incorporates into the bipartisan House bill. The compromise text assures that new agency guidance will include the kind of guidance clarity statement this bill has always sought. Small business owners and individuals across the country will be glad to know they will soon know for sure that agency guidance, however helpful and clarifying it often may be, is not legally binding upon them. I thank the chairwoman for her speedy efforts to make passage of this bill a bipartisan success. I also thank Senator Lankford and Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Chairman Peters for their efforts. And finally, I thank the sponsor of the House bill, Small Business Committee Ranking Member Luke Meyer, who has worked tirelessly on this bill since it was first introduced. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and this bill, and I look forward to the prompt enactment of this very smart bipartisan legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from New York. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 1508 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. I now call up H.R. 4465, the Federally Funded Research and Technology Development Protection Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 4465 to enhance transparency and accountability measures in federal grant-making to safeguard federally funded research and technology development and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4465, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself. I recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes. Mr. Lynch, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. I'd like to commend you, first of all, for your leadership as we continue our critical work to ensure that the United States is equipped to remain a global leader in artificial intelligence. I'd also like to thank Representative Virginia Foxx of North Carolina, my colleague, for co-sponsoring this important legislation. As chairman of the National Security Subcommittee, last week I introduced the Federally Funded Research and Technology Development Protection Act to curb the use of so-called foreign talent recruitment programs by Americans' adversaries, principally China, but others as well, to exploit innovations in U.S. research and development. This legislation is based on a key recommendation issued by the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and our subcommittee was privileged to hear testimony from some of its commissioners earlier this year. Through the integration of AI algorithms, applications, and systems to facilitate intelligence collection and analysis, battlefield, medical evacuations, and logistical missions, artificial intelligence is already transforming our national security. Our extensive research infrastructure, commitment to principles of research integrity, fair competition, and robust funding for research and development programs have made America the global leader in AI. However, as our adversaries also seek to develop and deploy AI for their own military and security purposes, the U.S. must be able to maintain the technological advantage we have enjoyed since the end of the Cold War. In their final report, the National Security Commission on AI warned that China's national plan for AI development envisions the use of so-called foreign talent recruitment programs to create a so-called high ground for China's AI experts. Contrary to their name, these programs do not legitimately attempt to compete for and recruit U.S. and other foreign talent. Rather, they are framed to facilitate the transfer of U.S. research and technology to China. In particular, China engages in, quote, part-time recruitment programs with U.S. academics and researchers. These recruits are instructed to attribute patents to their Chinese-affiliated institutions, even if the research was conducted here in the United States with U.S. funding. China also seeks to train its own experts using the proprietary knowledge gained from their U.S.-funded research in order to recreate that work at Chinese institutions. Not only do these programs facilitate the transfer of technology to a strategic competitor, they also undermine the norms of research integrity and collaboration that have driven many of the most important inventions of the last century. They also allow China to expand its AI footprint without having to expend resources. Simply put, we cannot allow this to continue. To this end, H.R. 4465 will require all federal grant-making agencies and institutions to conduct compliance operations to identify and disrupt malign foreign talent recruitment programs. The bill will also require agencies and institutions to institute standardized disclosure and accountability measures to support compliance operations. The federally funded Research and Technology Development Protection Act will ensure that federal grant-making institutions conduct strict oversight of the projects that they fund, thereby safeguarding them from theft and duplication by foreign rivals. In doing so, this bill will help to ensure that continued U.S. innovation in AI will enable us to maintain our strategic edge. So I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this legislation. Again, I thank Ms. Fox for her co-sponsorship. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member, Virginia Fox from North Carolina, for her statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, and I want to thank Subcommittee Chair Lynch for working with us on this very good bill. We all took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Today, we're facing foes who are working to use our government and processes against us. China, in particular, has figured out how to take one of our greatest strengths, American innovation, and use it against us. There are many documented cases of Chinese researchers and scholars taking federally funded grants to conduct research and development, then stealing the intellectual property and sending it back to China. Just 3 months ago, we read about an Ohio State University professor who was arrested for stealing NIH-funded research and sending it back to China to further its rheumatology and immunology expertise. Shortly before that, we saw a University of Florida professor indicted for taking a $1.75 million NIH grant for biomedical engineering research and sending the research back to China. Perhaps even more concerning than the outright theft of our research is that U.S. research can be co-opted by our adversaries to cause us harm. As this committee has discovered, the National Institutes of Health and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases funded dangerous viral research at the Wuhan Institute for years, which possibly led to the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. We must find a way to ensure that taxpayer resources are used to benefit our nation first and not be co-opted and used against us. All recipients of federal grant money ought to disclose their affiliations. It is essential that we know who is conducting research with taxpayer dollars so that we can prevent our research and development from falling into the hands of those who would do us harm. I'm pleased that this bill takes solid steps towards that goal. This bill was in a tenuous position earlier this week, but I'm pleased we were able to work out our differences and craft a bipartisan bill that will help safeguard American innovation from those who seek to do us harm. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this short but important bill and the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Madam Chair, for purposes of legislative intent, I would like to ask the bill's sponsor, Mr. Lynch, a clarifying question. Mr. Lynch, this bill states that, quote, the term malign foreign talent recruitment program means an effort directly or indirectly organized, managed, or funded by a foreign government to recruit any individual or public or private entity engaged in research funded directly or indirectly by a federal agency to share information with or otherwise on behalf of such foreign government. Would this definition include the 15 Chinese media outlets designated by the Trump administration as foreign missions?
Well, the legislation is really targeted toward these programs. So the pernicious activity that we are trying to get at is when U.S. researchers actually take the product of U.S. research and U.S. investment and deliver it to our adversaries. In this case, as you have noted, principally China. So I'd have to look more closely at the relationships you're identifying in the media if that would be included. I think it's you know, a prudent question to ask, but we are not in this case. The media has a less official or a less direct contact with our research institutions. What we have seen is that we actually have U.S. citizens that are being recruited by Chinese institutions, Chinese Communist Party-dominated institutions, to do research and to deliver research to that government. And that's what we're trying to get at. I think what you're suggesting is a much broader and amorphous activity that deserves concerns, but is not necessarily the principal target of this bill. I hope that answer is sufficient.
Yes, sir. It's very sufficient. Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Thank you for the good work on this bill. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize myself. I want to thank our National Security Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Lynch, and our colleague, Dr. Fox, for their thoughtful and very important leadership on this national security bill. The bill would require the Office of Management and Budget to enhance transparency and accountability measures in federal grant making to safeguard federally funded research and technology development. Specifically, it would require federal grant-making agencies to maintain compliance operations to guard against malign foreign talent recruitment programs. OMB would also be required to establish standardized disclosure and accountability measures to support these compliance operations government-wide. If we are to be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars and to realize the strategic benefits of federal research investments, then we must have strong state safeguards in place to guard against the transfer of innovation and intellectual property to geopolitical competitors. I urge my colleagues to support this important bill and I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition?
Madam Chair.
The ranking member is now recognized. Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sure you would agree that vibrant national research, innovation, and free markets are what makes America great. Unfortunately, many malign foreign countries, particularly China, are methodically infiltrating our academic and research institutions and attempting to steal innovations, research, and development funded by American taxpayers. Under the Trump administration, both the Department of Education and the FBI worked hard to identify, stop, and hold accountable those who infiltrated soft targets such as U.S. institutions of higher education and academic research. For instance, the Department of Education opened 12 investigations into unreported foreign investment into universities. It found $6.5 billion in previously unreported dollars. Included in this shocking finding were universities working with banned Chinese telecom companies, contracts directly with the Central Committee of the Communist Chinese Party, funding for programs like the Chinese central government's Thousands Talents Plan, with the goal to convince U.S. universities to funnel information directly to China, and also contracts for development of crowd surveillance technology that could subsequently be used to find and detain Chinese Muslim minorities. The FBI arrested numerous individuals, including one for sending confidential U.S. military data and personal information to China, one whom replicated the layout of a U.S. medical lab and submitted her design to the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and another stealing U.S. artificial intelligence technology. This should be deeply unsettling to the American people, Congress, and the Oversight Committee. I'm glad we can take steps here today to address this problem by considering bipartisan legislation led by my colleagues Mr. Lynch, Chairman of the House Oversight National Security Subcommittee, and Dr. Fox, Ranking Member of the House Education and Labor Committee. The federally funded Research and Technology Development Protection Act is a strong step forward to protect federally funded research and specifically hold China accountable. However, there is much more to be done. We've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic how U.S. taxpayer funds ended up supporting the activities at the Wuhan Institute of Virology with little to no oversight. The Wuhan Institute was constructed and used by the People's Liberation Army to conduct secret virology research. You know, that would be a good investigation for this committee to undertake. China has a biological weapons program. American tax dollars should not be funding our adversaries' malicious activities. Again, H.R. 4465 is a good first step to add an extra layer of protection for federally funded research, and I applaud the chairwoman and my colleague, Mr. Lynch, for working with us to strengthen the legislation. I'm hopeful this bill will be the first of many to reform and reevaluate our position as it relates to foreign involvement in sensitive and valuable U.S. research. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from New York. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4465 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to it. I now call up H.R. 564, the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 564 to provide paid family and medical leave to federal employees and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 564 offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the amendment. I was proud to introduce H.R. 564, the Comprehensive Paid Leave for Federal Employees Act, in January, and I'm grateful for the support of many of my colleagues on this committee who are original co-sponsors of the legislation. This bill would finally provide federal employees with comprehensive paid family and medical leave. That means employees would have access to paid leave if they get sick, need to care for a sick family member, or need to miss work due to a family member's military deployment. The Family and Medical Leave Act guarantees unpaid leave for these reasons, but unpaid leave is not a viable option for many federal workers. My bill would finally provide paid leave in these circumstances. This is a policy that is long overdue for the federal workforce and for the nation. In the committee's hearing on this issue last month, we heard about the dire need for universal paid leave, like the one included in the American Families Plan. Unfortunately, from what we heard at our hearing, there seems to be a disagreement among some of my colleagues on an essential point. Every family in the nation needs paid leave. Millions of Americans have had the agonizing experience of being forced to give up a paycheck in order to recover from an illness, care for a loved one, or help at home when a family member has been deployed. And families of federal workers are no different. In this bill, all the current eligibility criteria from the FMLA remain intact. There is a 12-month serious service requirement, and an employee would need to put in a request to the agency they work for and provide any necessary justification. And 12 weeks per year would remain the limit that an employee could take paid family and medical leave. Some opponents of this bill have said that federal employees already have paid annual and sick leave benefits, and that is true. But these benefits serve a fundamentally different purpose than comprehensive paid family and medical leave. Federal employees should not have to deplete their sick or annual leave because Congress has unwillingness to provide paid leave to deal with a longer-term hardships. After more than a year of a global pandemic, why would we accept policies that actually create an incentive for workers to come to work sick because they can't afford to take a sick day? Our committee has been working hard to ensure that the 2.6 million federal employees who deliver services to the American people every day can take care of themselves and their families. Our committee was instrumental in passing paid parental leave for federal employees in 2019. H.R. 564 would expand paid family and medical leave, extend paid family and medical leave for employees beyond the pandemic, and provide a roadmap for the rest of the nation's workforce. As we learned at our hearing, paid leave doesn't just help workers, it also helps employers. Employers who provide paid leave see improvements in productivity, retention, and recruitment. Paid leave for federal employees helps the people who work for the federal government and offers opportunities for the federal government to attract a strong, committed workforce. As the federal workforce is aging, we need to think ahead about how we can make sure the federal government remains a competitive employer. H.R. 564 will strengthen the federal workforce over the long term, and it sets an example in creating a fair and safe workplace. In the amendment I have offered, there is an important clarification for parents who've experienced a stillbirth or child loss and employees who are acting as surrogates for another family. The amendment clarifies that these events entitle employees to paid leave under the policy. This provides equity for parents who have experienced a tragic loss during childbirth to make sure they have the recovery time they need. I particularly want to thank Congresswoman Presley for her leadership on ensuring these provisions were included in the bill before us today. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 564, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, Ranking Member, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's compare the Republican approach to the federal workforce with the Democrats. Republicans believe federal employees should get the job done for the American people and should be held accountable when they do not. Under President Trump, that was the focus. Through executive orders, the prior administration took steps to make sure federal employees could be held accountable. That's what the American people deserve. Democrats, however, do not want this. Rather than holding federal employees accountable, they want to protect poorly performing federal employees while dramatically increasing their benefits. The Biden administration and congressional Democrats are pushing permanent, expanded telework as a national policy. They are doing this without understanding the impact expanded telework has had on the ability of federal agencies to deliver on their missions to the American public over the past several months. We already have evidence agencies are falling short. For example, the National Archives has become a bottleneck in the processing of veterans' health benefits. Committee Republicans have requested a hearing to understand why federal bureaucrats have been unable to help America's veterans get the records they need to prove their benefits claims to these same federal bureaucrats. Rather than ensuring federal agencies are meeting their missions, especially in the wake of COVID-related shutdowns, we are considering expanding another benefit for the already well-paid and well-protected federal workforce. The possibility of an additional 12 weeks of paid leave renewable every year at the taxpayer's expense. Yes, you heard that correctly. Congress just provided paid parental leave for federal workers in 2019's Federal Employee Paid Leave Act. And now, less than 2 years later, before we know the full impacts of that expansion of leave on the federal government, the majority is seeking to expand paid leave even further by covering all categories mentioned in the Family Medical Leave Act. Federal employees would be eligible for this type of leave every year on top of their ordinary annual leave. So combined with federal holidays under this legislation, a federal employee might work only 8 months out of the year, even less in some cases. The majority does not even know how much this benefit expansion will cost. We don't know the consequences, but they sure do know they want to massively increase perks for federal employees, while private sector employees are scrambling to find good-paying jobs in an economy with growing inflation. Think how much private sector employees would love to have this perk. The chairwoman has said repeatedly and very dramatically that this kind of leave is not a perk. The chairwoman even went so far as to tweet and promote her tweet of her dramatic remarks about the perk. In fact, in any English dictionary, perk is defined as something you receive as well as your wages for doing a particular job. In fact, this bill requires American taxpayers to further subsidize wonderful perks for federal workers they themselves can only dream of. This legislation even wraps in the U.S. Postal Service. Given all the work we have done on postal reform, we know quite well ever-rising operational and workforce costs have driven America's Postal Service to the brink of financial insolvency. The chairwoman and I have worked hard on bipartisan legislation to help the Postal Service thrive for the American people, and I fear that this legislation represents another unrealistic congressional mandate piled onto an institution that's supposed to operate independently. Let's not take the Postal Service backwards by imposing hundreds of millions of dollars in additional annual costs on a struggling organization. The Postal Service workforce is well represented and already has robust benefits. Madam Chairwoman, millions of Americans are working just to get their jobs back and get their lives back to normal after the COVID-19 pandemic. These Americans endured having their businesses and employers shut down, their schools closed, and their communities shuttered. In fact, many, especially mothers, had to make tough choices between keeping their jobs or educating their children. But not a single federal worker was forced to make such a choice. They were never at risk of losing their jobs. What better benefit is there than that? And yet here Democrats are, on the heels of providing paid parental leave during the pandemic, trying to give federal workers even more paid benefits, a massive perk, cost unknown. And Democrats are asking American taxpayers to pay for these benefits, just as the Biden administration has opened the floodgates of federal spending with a tidal wave of wasteful and unnecessary aid that threatens to drown our nation's economy in inflation. Meanwhile, the Democrats' policies are insulating federal employees from the kinds of fears and pressures America's taxpayers have to face. If the federal government wants to lead by example, as the majority has suggested, it should lead in getting its employees back to work in person and helping small businesses get their employees back to work too. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes herself for a response. The gentleman complained that the Democrats did not know how much this would cost. Well, now we do. The CBO's preliminary estimate is that providing paid family and medical leave to federal employees would increase direct spending by only $53 million over 10 years. Just $53 million, the federal government can ensure that its employees will be able to take care of themselves and their loved ones without sacrificing their paycheck. And let me be clear, investing in paid family and medical leave will give dividends for the federal government and the American taxpayer. A 2019 study by Panorama and the American Sustainable Business Council found that large technology companies that adopted paid leave policies on average experienced a $2.64 return for every dollar invested in their workforce. Manufacturing companies saw $2.57 return. This was an improvement in productivity of 6.5% and 3.6% for each industry, respectively. So if my Republican colleagues are not compelled by the moral case of providing support for families, I hope they can at least understand the business case for it. And I yield back, and I now recognize my colleague in government, Ms. Presley, who helped draft some important parts of this bill. Ms. Presley is now recognized, and then we'll be back to the Republican side.
Move to strike the last word. Thank you, Madam Chair. Respectfully, I hope that our colleagues across the aisle, that they and their families never experience the type of medical or caregiving crises that necessitate taking paid leave for virtually every family that calls this nation home. That is not the case. Our greatest wealth as a nation is the health of our families, and our families have been destabilized because of many disruptive life events. I value the family, and that should take precedence, and in fact, I does support those broader goals around our GDP. We need to be supporting our families. I want to thank the Chair for your leadership on this critical issue of consequence. Thank you and your staff for your partnership on including the language that incorporates tenets of my bicameral support through Lost Act with Senator Duckworth. This past year, again, has been a persistent reminder of the disruptive life events that families experience, and our goal in enacting this necessary, long overdue paid leave policy is to support families across the nation as they navigate adversity, health crises, and critical caregiving responsibilities. Specifically, I want to commend you for incorporating our language naming pregnancy loss and other challenges that workers may face as they start or grow their families, like unsuccessful fertility treatment or failed adoption or surrogacy arrangement, as a qualifying event. While often underreported, it is estimated that miscarriage or pregnancy loss occurs in at least 10 to 15% of known pregnancies. Due to a lack of public awareness and cultural stigma, many people are unaware of how prevalent pregnancy loss is until their families experience it firsthand. Pregnancy loss, like all disruptive life events, should be met with care, compassion, support, and paid leave. This bill will ensure that workers who have experienced pregnancy loss or other challenges are afforded the time necessary to heal and to recover. Madam Chair, again, I thank you for your partnership on this and for your continued eye towards healthcare justice, gender equity, inclusion, and progress. I yield.
Would my friend yield? Ms. Presley,
Sure.
I thank my friend. You know, the ranking member said, let's look at the Republican versus Democratic approach to federal employees. Yeah, let's look at it. Frankly, for the last decade, my Republican friends on the other side of the aisle, especially when they're in the majority, never missed an opportunity to demonize the federal employee. They're not public servants. They're bureaucrats. They don't have a benefit package like other employees around America. They have perks. The language is deliberate to demonize federal employees, to somehow make them fat bureaucrats who don't really do a job. And it's a disservice to the men and women who serve our constituents, whether it be in the VA or the Social Security Administration or the IRS or our national parks or our health services in a pandemic. They deserve better. And yet during this time period, when Republicans were in charge, we saw shutdowns, we saw pay freezes, we saw pay cuts, we saw cutbacks in pension programs, we saw an attempt to extend a new hire to a 2-year probationary period. We took away organizing rights and representation on the work floor and the workplace to make it harder to pursue grievances. We've allowed the Merit System Protection Board to have no board members so that no appeals could be heard on behalf of federal employees. So let's put this in that context. I welcome the contrast between the Republican and Democratic approach to the 2.1 million hardworking men and women who serve this country every day and who deserve the nobility and respect from this committee of all committees for their endeavors, especially on behalf of the American people during a pandemic. I thank my friend for yielding.
Would the gentleman yield to a question?
It is not my time, it is Ms. Presley's.
Would the
I yield.
gentlelady yield?
I yield.
Gentlelady, isn't it true that during the Trump administration that we passed a parental leave, or parental leave was granted for federal employees?
It is true that after a pandemic-induced recession, which destabilized families, and many people had to assume caregiving responsibilities, the Democrats fought for paid leave to be included, yes?
So it's correct when we say we've already extended parental leave for federal employees, correct?
It's correct that we are still in a pandemic and experiencing a pandemic-induced recession, and our families have been destabilized and continue to experience great hardship. That's true. So we should still be including paid leave. But there are many disruptive life events destabilizing families. I vice chair the Task Force on Aging and Families, and the sandwich generation taking care of an aging parent and a young child, 80% of them are experiencing passive suicidal thoughts. These families feel invisible. So the greatest wealth of our nation is the health of our people, and we should be doing our families, and we should be doing whatever we need to do to stabilize our families. That's paramount.
If I may just say, that was in the NDAA last October. It had nothing to do with the pandemic, just to set the record straight. And Madam Chair, I think figure you gave a while ago was inaccurate. It is impossible that this only costs $53 million over 10 years. The correct number is $53 billion. And I would ask the chairwoman to look at those numbers again. There's no way providing federal employees 4 months a year not working only costs $53 million over 10 years.
We will review the numbers. The chair now recognizes Mr. Heiss for 5 minutes. The gentlelady's time has expired.
I thank the chairwoman. That is what my comments were. There's no way your numbers could be accurate. There's no way. The CBO is more than $53 million over 10
We will review the numbers, but there were other reports that I talked about that also talked about the importance of a paid family.
Why did we not receive that report?
Well, we'll get them to you. And the chair recognized, may I, you have the time, may I respond?
Yes, I'm asking for you to respond.
Well, we'll get you the reports, but it's true that it was part of the NDAA, and it was paid family
Which was in
leave.
October before the pandemic, correct?
Right, it was before the pandemic, but it was paid leave for the birth of a child, and it was
But it
by
had
bill.
nothing to do with the pandemic, which is what we just heard. It
Well,
was.
It was before the pandemic.
Thank you for that
But it was
clarification.
critically important, and at the time we did a report with the United Nations on all the countries in the world, and there were only 2 that did not provide paid leave for the birth of a child. It was the United States and Papua New Guinea. This was a United Nations report. So I'm very proud of that addition to the NDAA to provide paid leave for federal employees. We were far behind the private sector, which was providing paid leave for the birth of a child.
If
Now,
I
that
may
is
reclaim my
different.
time,
That
Madam
is
Chair.
different from, okay, reclaiming your time.
And I'll be happy to yield back to you. My point was that it was totally detached from the pandemic. It was in October, before the pandemic ever started. We did vote on extending medical leave, family leave, and now we are coming back trying to do more.
No.
And it is the American people who are footing
Point
the
of
bill.
point of clarification, if I could. That vote was paid leave for the birth of a child only. It was not for sick leave or family emergencies.
No, we are extending it now. I get that.
yeah,
It's
but this
being
is
expanded now.
But that
my
vote
point
was only
is,
paid leave.
But my point is the American people are footing the bill. And we are extending it to the extreme now that federal workers can have up to 4 months a year of not working, 100% of that resting on the shoulders of the American taxpayer. That is unfair, unjust, uncalled for, and an absolute waste of money. And I believe this committee needs to get back to the responsibility of doing oversight, which we continue to ignore and to bypass in this committee. And we continue doing these silly hearings that we have rather than committing oversight, which is our responsibility. But I just wanted clarification on these couple of issues. And with that, I appreciate very much the fact you've given me some time. And with that, I'll yield back.
Well, the chair recognizes herself to respond. I would not call giving, this is for deployment for the military. It is for sick leave and family emergencies and situations that families confront. And it is not a perk, it is not a vacation, and it has to be, has requirements before it can be granted that you must prove the emergency that the family is experiencing. And those of us, most families in America, both parents have to work. Both parents have to work. It's required. And there is very little support. The child care tax credit and the expansion of the child care tax credit and the expansion of the deduction, the needy deductions will lift half of the children in America out of poverty. I think that's a great goal to have, and to have work-family balance for emergencies in families that they confront is a necessity and something that's important for families to have. And I would say that when you say it's too costly, what's more important than protecting families and making families stronger? It's an investment in the future. And with that, I yield back.
Would the chairwoman yield for a few quick questions?
Yes, absolutely. Mr. Conley.
Is it not true, Madam Chairwoman, that the existing federal workforce, civilian workforce, about 40% of it is eligible for retirement over the next several years?
That's true. We have a crisis, really, because so many people are leaving.
So we have to recruit a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And is it not also true that compared to the private sector, the age cohort in the federal government is much higher, and the number of people, percentage of people under 30 is much lower by comparison with the private sector?
That's true.
And therefore, we have a unique challenge, do we not, in recruiting and retaining a younger cohort for the future of the federal workforce, and they have certain expectations with respect to this family life work balance that is a cultural change we need to take cognizance of. And is it not true that the chairwoman is doing precisely that in this initiative she's put before us?
The gentleman is absolutely accurate, and I'd just like to close by saying that workers don't choose when they or a loved one becomes sick, and military service members don't get to choose when they get deployed, and their families don't choose whether to care for them if they become ill or if they become injured. These are crises that families confront, and this is providing that support and for families when they face these types of crises. And you cannot imagine the amount of pressure that it puts on families when these situations arise. I now yield back. Now, who else seeks recognition? Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs is now recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for recognizing me. I want to spend a minute or two talking about the purported CBO scoring of $53 million over 10 years. First of all, I am dismayed that I'm sitting in the middle of a hearing that apparently the majority has some CBO report that the minority didn't receive. I find that unacceptable. It's, I mean, if this really is the important topic that it has been made out to be, then information should have been shared with the minority so we could see that CBO report. Because I'm left with some questions. $53 million over 10 years, that's $5.3 million a year. That's what you're saying in a federal government that employs over 2 million people. You're telling us and the world, well, it's only going to cost $5.3 million. That's just a preliminary report, of course, and we'll get you that. $5.3 million for 2 million employees. Does that include the impact of loss of productivity of employees that avail themselves of this new benefit? I don't know.
Will the gentleman yield?
Not yet.
Okay.
I don't know. There's no report. I can't see a report. I have no idea. Did they address that question? How about this one? Does it include the expense of paying for temporary employees? I don't know. I don't have a report. Somebody does, apparently. We don't. Does it include the macroeconomic expense that will undoubtedly result? For instance, passports. Right now, passports are really, really backed up. Why? Because of the COVID. I don't know how your office is, but my office is inundated with passport backlogs. If you start granting more people out and you don't replace those people, the backlogs increase. And who suffers? The citizen does. The citizen does. And that's whom the federal government is supposed to serve, is that citizen. The federal government does not exist to provide jobs to federal employees. It exists to further ostensibly the mission of the United States of America and benefit and protect the rights of citizens. That's what the federal government does. So when I'm sitting in a hearing today, and I'm sure that the gentlelady, who I'll yield to in just a second to respond, is going to tell me summarize what she finds in this report that I haven't seen, and no one, as far as I know, whether staff or member on the minority side has seen. She's going to respond to that. Well, how would I know how accurate those responses are? And not that she would deliberately mislead, but that we each might read something and say, well, wait, what about this? Or how do you characterize that? We might have a logical debate on it. We can't have rhetorical discourse because you've got something I don't have. And so with that, I'll yield to the gentlelady.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and you do have it now because we sent it to all the Republican offices right now. And I want to clarify that I was correct, that the CBO estimate that this bill would only cost $53 million, as in million, in direct spending, not billion. I would like to place it in the record. And, well,
So-
this is the CBO estimate.
So I'll reclaim my time. Thank you. I just got a copy. This is my first I've seen of this.
so
So
that-
what it does, Madam Chair, is they're taking a straight line, non-discursive view of this, and they don't include everything. So, for instance, the questions that I just asked, they're not included in that. There's nothing about macroeconomics. There's nothing about any temporary employees that might be necessary. It doesn't include anything about productivity or increased backlogs, which will have to be addressed sometime. There's nothing in there. So in other words, it's not dynamic scoring here. Second thing is, it doesn't include their own estimate with regard to the USPS, if you add those in, which is $200 million annually. So, I mean, this little chart here, to the world who's looking at it, is quite frankly, it's misrepresentative of what will ultimately cost to implement this new program. So I'm dismayed that it's become part of our discussion today, but nonetheless, I find it to be valueless, quite frankly. And I thank the gentlelady for giving me time, and my time's expired, now you'll back.
The gentleman yelled back, and we are putting this on our website, and we're putting this, putting it out to all of the members, and it is the CBO score. And I now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Porter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to talk about the costs of not providing comprehensive paid federal leave, which are very, very real and are extremely expensive to our government and to its ability to deliver for the people. I agree with my colleague, Mr. Biggs, that government's job is to do the important work of serving the people. But having comprehensive paid family leave creates a stronger, more productive, less expensive workplace. I hear a lot from colleagues on the other side about the importance of looking at what the private sector is doing, at looking at what capitalism is doing. And in our country, the private sector and capitalist forces have concluded that comprehensive paid family leave is good for their labor workforce. And that is why, long before we mandated it, many companies have it, and it's why many companies today, including some of the largest and most successful companies in this country, go beyond what the law later mandated. There is an incredible cost to not passing paid comprehensive leave. Talent exits our federal workforce and sometimes never comes back. When it does come back, there are costs to retraining. There are costs to productivity. There are costs to having to put in place replacement employees because people exit the workplace permanently rather than in a planned and temporary way under a limited set of circumstances. So I know that we're having a discussion about the CBO score and the direct and indirect costs, and that is a very important discussion to have. But I want to be very clear that there is a cost to not retaining our best and brightest workers, who are going to include people who get cancer. They are going to include people who deploy to protect our country and the armed services. It's going to include people who give birth. So the costs to not passing comprehensive paid family leave are also extremely real and are plaguing the retention, the recruitment, and the productivity of our federal workforce today. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Keller is now recognized. Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do want to recognize the work of the federal employees that get the job done every day. They're thoughtful, they're hardworking, and they do receive benefits. And they're allowed to accumulate their benefits. The OPM website, if you go out and look at the benefits, they can accumulate sick time, they earn sick time. It can be advanced to them if they don't have enough. So there's a lot of benefits that are already available for employees to help take care of medical needs to themselves and or their family members. In fact, it's up to 12 weeks of sick leave can be used to care for a family member with a serious health condition each year. So they can use that. It's already available. Are we looking at putting more on top of the benefits that are already afforded the hardworking people of our country? And I'll use an example, and I'll use a personal example. My wife used to work for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and she could accrue her time. And when she started working there, she did. And when our son was 3 years old, he had an accident. He had a head injury. He was flown to the hospital, and they performed brain surgery. He was not expected to live. In fact, the doctors wanted to disconnect him from life support. My wife had time because she accumulated the benefits she earned as, I thought I heard somebody make a comment, I'm sorry. She had saved that time and used it to care for our son. So there are benefits that are available, and it's about helping people take care of their families. We want to make sure that happens. There are already federal benefits that allow people to do this. It's not like our federal employees have no means to accrue sick time to care for themselves or their family members. And we need to make sure that what we're doing is responsible with all the information that is available. And I'm looking at the report, and I'm really concerned that we had a meeting here where we got a report during the meeting. Usually, I don't know what the other side of the aisle does, but when information is sent out, I read it before I come to the meeting. And I think it's really disingenuous of the chair to send out information that we didn't have during a meeting. So this is something I'm very passionate about because we are dealing with families. We are dealing with people that are in crisis when these things happen. But it's not that we're not compassionate. We care. We provide benefits. We work with families. But we do it in a responsible manner with all the information so we can make the best decision possible for all concerned. So, and like I said, I can submit this report or this download I got here from OPM, Office of Personnel Management, that explains the federal sick leave. I don't know if anybody's looked at it or read it. I have, and it does explain how it's earned. It explains how federal employees can access that sick leave. It allows it to be advanced, so if somebody does need that, they can do it. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and for us to be having this bill come forward in this committee, Oversight Committee, yet we don't get all the information on the issue until we're in the meeting. There ought to be some oversight on how this came about, quite frankly. So if the chair doesn't mind, I would like to submit this for the record so it's in the record that we already do allow people to use up to 12 weeks of sick leave. We allow them to earn sick time to care for themselves or their families. And with that, I yield back.
Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Norman is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just join my colleagues to have a meeting like this and just to get these facts is really unacceptable. If you look at the footnotes, these amounts do not include the effects of the U.S. Postal Service. There are close to 500,000 postal employees. This does not include this. Now, if you believe 53 million or 55 billion, it doesn't matter. If you believe that cost, I've got some land that's underwater I need to sell you for a high-rise condo project. You know, what's being left out in all this discussion is the fact that the states form the federal government, not vice versa. And the fact that we're having the discussion of spending more money. And Madam Chair, I would dispute the 2.6 million employees that work for the federal government. After the illegals coming in this country, going on the public payroll, we're going to have far more employees than's here now. So you're not taking into account the growth. You ask the average small business who is paying the bills for this, which is no offset, do they want more federal government involvement? No. They want to reduce the workforce, the federal workforce. The $2.6 million is just a drop in the bucket. It's really disingenuous to have figures to spout out $53 million when we didn't have the benefit of looking at how you got the number or why. Where is the I guess the concern for the taxpayers? Where is the concern for the small business that's paying the bills? Where is the concern for the real issues that's confronting this country? Inflation. Try buying gas lately? You try buying food at the grocery store? That's hurting the everyday Americans across the board. And so, Madam Chair, I would ask that as we move forward, we get on to some real issues that instead of spending more money with no offsets, it's a embarrassment to the American people. It's embarrassment to the world. And I think that the fact that we're spending this amount of time, and I think we've been here close to 2.5 hours, is really a waste of time and something we shouldn't even be talking about with the issues that are facing this country today. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We've been here 1 hour. We've debated roughly 5 different bills, and this is an official report from the OPM office, the CBO office. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Comer is now recognized.
I would like to make a motion due to the fact that, number one, we find it hard to believe this CBO score, and we have questions for the Congressional Budget Office. Next, due to the fact that it doesn't include the cost and the effects on the Postal Service, as Mr. Norman, Mr. Biggs, and Mr. Heiss have all mentioned, and we need to know what not only cost does that have to the Postal Service, but what are the effects on the mail? Because if you'll remember, when we've had DeJoy and others from the Postal Service, and we rightfully asked them questions, why was the mail so backed up over the Christmas period? One of the reasons was there were so many people that missed because of COVID and other things. We need to know this because we're almost at the finish line on the House floor with the postal reform bill. This is a big question for the Postal Service because we've already discussed the problems with absenteeism within the Postal Service. So we're creating, legislation that you all have drafted that would enhance that and increase that. And you look at what's wrong with the economy now with our employers complaining to all of us, and I know they've complained to the Democrats as well. They can't get workers to show up because they're being incentivized because of bad policy to not work. They're being paid stimulus bills, which are unfortunately causing some people not to come to work because they don't have to. And now we're looking at legislation that you all propose that would potentially make the mail even further delayed, increase the debt even more, require you all to print more money, which will continue to increase inflation. So there are a lot of questions and problems that Republicans have on behalf of the American taxpayer with this bill, and they just aren't answered, and they're not credible, quite frankly, with this CBO report. So I make a motion to table this bill until we get further clarification from the CBO on the cost, the dynamic scoring, and the cost to the U.S. Postal Service.
I second.
Motion and second.
It is not a proper motion, and the gentleman and anyone here is welcome to go talk to CBO about how they got to the $53 million over 10 years.
Before the
so
markup?
You are welcome to go talk to them. Is there anyone else who seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I table the motion. The bill. I make a motion to table. I make a motion to lay this bill on the table until we get further clarification from the CBO.
It's not a proper motion, and
has
you
to
can...
be a proper
You can
motion.
get your information someplace else, okay? I think
Parliamentary
this-
inquiry, you have to be able to make a motion to table the bill. That's parliamentary procedure.
You can make a motion for the previous question.
I want to make a motion on the previous question. We're having good debate here.
Make a motion to adjourn?
I mean, I'm fine. Go ahead and make it.
Make a motion, we adjourn, Madam Chair.
Well, the question now occurs on the gentleman's, pardon me?
We'll pause for a second.
Pause for a second.
Second.
It's not a matter of undoing, it's a matter of let's table this and get more information. We were just now given information that is pertinent to us making a decision to support this or not. We need answers to questions before we vote on this, and you're saying that it's okay for y'all to come to the last minute, withhold information, it's best us to vote on it. That is not the process. Table it until we discuss this.
You can request that the chair move this bill to the next markup, and there's a prerogative to
Isn't that the same as tabling?
It's not as a parliamentary matter. You can't just.
We have not been given information.
I question your parliamentary decision there. I don't think that's right.
It can't be right.
It's not right.
We have not even been privy to information, and now we're expected to vote on something that raises enormous questions about this whole bill. And you're saying, tough, you can't do anything about it. That is not, that can't be right.
Madam Chair, regular order.
Gentleman calls for regular order.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair, under Robert's Rules of Order, and I know we have our own rules, but the motion to lay on the table refers to temporarily setting aside a pending motion or a series of pending motions to take care of something else deemed urgent. So again, I believe that I'm in order to make a motion to table this bill. I yield back.
There's no proper motion pending. Why don't we just have a vote on whether to adjourn or not?
Madam Chair, I move to table the motion to adjourn.
We're not there yet. The chair calls a 5-minute recess in order to resolve this disagreement. Committee The committee will come to order, and Mr. Heiss is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I ask for a roll call vote on a motion to adjourn, please.
Do you make a motion to adjourn?
I'm making a motion to adjourn. I request a roll call vote.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Mfumi is now recognized.
Madam Chair, I move to table the motion.
The vote is on tabling the motion to adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Ask for a roll call.
A recorded vote has been requested, and a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Mr. Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
I vote aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Acacia-Cortez?
Aye.
Ms. Acacia-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes aye.
Ms. Talib votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Email me this morning and said.
Aye. Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis?
Aye.
Are you on mute?
Davis votes aye. So they muted me.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
You know what I said about the,
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
funny.
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms.
Aye.
Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Aye.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Sonny votes aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez votes aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley? Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Quigley?
Aye.
Mr. Quigley votes aye. Mr. Comer?
Comer votes no.
Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Gosar?
No.
Mr. Gosar votes no. Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde? Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin? Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon? No. Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds?
How is Ms. Fox recorded?
Ms. Fox is not recorded.
Ms. Fox votes no.
Ms. Fox votes no.
How am I recorded? Ms. Spear?
Ms. Spear, you are not recorded.
Spear votes yes.
Ms. Spear votes yes.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded? It's Raskin.
Mr. Raskin is not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes aye. On this vote, we have 24 ayes and 12 nays.
How is Mr. Grothman recorded?
Mr. who? Mr. Grossman? Do you
Mr.
wish to
Grothman
be-
is not recorded. Mr. Grothman
Am I
votes
recorded?
no.
Has everyone been recognized?
Madam Chair, how have I been recorded?
Mr. Khanna?
Mr. Khanna
I'd
is
like to
not.
vote yes.
Mr. Khanna votes aye.
The clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, we have 24 ayes and 13 nays.
The motion is tabled. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlelady from New York. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 564 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye.
Madam Chair.
Aye.
Aye.
Seek recognition for the purpose of making a motion.
Okay. Gentleman is recognized.
I really hate to be disruptive in this committee hearing, but we have legitimate questions about the CBO score. No one on our side believes the CBO score. We have questions about what was included, what was not included. I understand the argument that you have to pass the bill before you can see what was in it, but what's clear with the CBO score is it doesn't include the cost to the Postal Service. And because
Madam Chair, point of order.
that is our primary jurisdiction, and we're working in a bipartisan manner on postal reform, we
Gentlemen,
need to know.
the Postal Service is not part of it. It's off
My
budget.
motion, we need to know what it's going to cost and the effects on the Postal Service. I would like to ask the Postmaster General and others with the Postal Service, how
Will
much
the
is this going
gentleman
to cost the Postal
state
Service?
your motion? and let's
I
have
make a
vote on it.
motion, I move to table this bill until we have further information on the cost, and the cost not just to the taxpayers, but the cost of lost productivity to the government agencies.
The motion is not in order, and as we have stated before, the CBO number is here, and they will not do a complete CBO number until it is passed out of the committee.
Let me
So that's
rephrase
what
my
we have
motion.
said.
May I motion to postpone then?
To postpone the markup?
Until we can
You wanna
postpone
postpone the markup?
Whatever, till we get the answers. We need to know. The taxpayers don't
Okay,
want
we have a
Congress to
motion.
pass more bills without knowing the cost. Make a motion to
Recognize
postpone.
Mr. Mfume.
Madam Chair, I move to table the motion.
The gentleman has moved to table the motion, and the vote is on tabling the motion. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no.
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 The ayes have it, and the motion is tabled. A recorded vote has been requested, and a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Mr. Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib? Ms. Porter?
Aye.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear?
Spear votes aye.
Ms. Spear votes aye. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes aye.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. DeSagne?
Sonia votes aye.
Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez votes aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley? Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Quigley?
Aye.
Mr. Quigley votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Gosar?
No.
Mr. Gosar votes no. Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman votes no. Mr. Sessions?
No.
Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde?
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace?
Madam Chairwoman,
Mr.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Franklin? Mr. LaTurner? Mr. Fallon? Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds? Mr. Donalds votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Madam Chairwoman? Madam Chairwoman?
Mr. Conley?
How am I recorded?
Mr. Connolly is not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Dr. Fox is not recorded. Dr. Fox votes no.
Does anyone else wish to be recorded?
How am I recorded?
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Khanna is not recorded.
I'd like to vote yes.
Mr. Khanna votes aye.
Who's not recorded? Do we have all people? Does anyone else wish to be recorded? The clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, we have 22 ayes and 15 nays.
Okay, the motion is tabled. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 564 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 7 and Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Okay. I now call up H.R. 2994, the Accountability for Acting Officials Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 2994 to amend Title V United States Code to modify the provisions of that title relating to the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998 and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerks will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2994, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of the amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of this legislation, Ms. Katie Porter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We are a country of 330 million people with a huge economy and the most powerful military in the world. Our government must be led by qualified individuals who are accountable to the public in their roles as citizens and taxpayers. And on the people's behalf, elected representatives in Congress must hold executives to account. This includes inspectors general, who are independent watchdogs who protect taxpayer dollars from waste, fraud, and abuse, and who make sure that government programs are working as intended. These positions, these inspector general positions, like other high government positions, must be filled with qualified, experienced public servants. My bill would bring greater accountability to the process for filling vacant positions in federal departments and agencies and make sure that these positions can't be left empty by any president seeking to avoid public accountability. My bill would improve on the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998, which authorizes the president to name an official to serve in an acting capacity until there is a permanent appointee for the Senate to consider. The Federal Vacancies Reform Act limits who can serve in these temporary roles to guard against people without appropriate experience from taking on these responsibilities. However, loopholes in this law have allowed prior presidents to leave positions vacant. Most recently, President Trump abused the loopholes in this law in new and unprecedented ways, leaving key agencies without qualified leaders during one of the greatest challenges our country has ever faced. This not only deprived the American people of strong, experienced leadership, but it left Congress unable to fulfill its constitutional responsibility to approve political officials and to conduct oversight. My bill would close these loopholes so that acting officials are more accountable to Congress and to the American people, regardless of the party that controls the White House. Good government reforms, like my bill, have historically received bipartisan support. FIVRA legislation has a history of bipartisanship, and reforms to it should continue this legacy. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote in support of this bill. Thank you.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Comer's now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The sponsor of this bill claims it will improve the process of filling vacancies in top positions in federal agencies, but it will not. And further, it will make it more difficult for a duly elected president to carry out his constitutional duties. Current law allows the president to temporarily fill vacancies in top positions at federal agencies. This bill, however, would significantly restrict the president's ability to pick temporary replacements of their own choosing. The bill prohibits the president from filling a vacancy with a new hire at the agency. Instead, it requires the vacancy be filled with someone who has served at the agency for at least the entire preceding year. In other words, the bill requires the president to pick a longer-serving federal bureaucrat over a fresh face who might be more willing to carry out the president's policies. That's a bad deal for the American people, and I urge everyone to oppose this bill. I yield back.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Heiss is now recognized.
I make a motion we adjourn.
A motion to adjourn has been made. Ms. Porter?
I move to lay the motion on the table.
A motion to lay it on the table.
Point of order.
Has been.
Motion to adjourn is not able to be placed on the table.
Okay. A motion to adjourn has been laid on the table. Wait.
Madam Chair, point of order.
Yes.
A motion for adjournment is not debatable, not substitutable, and you cannot provide a subsidiary motion to a motion to adjourn.
All right. All those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
No. The noes have it. A roll call vote has been called. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes no.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Connolly votes nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna?
I'm sorry, which name did you say?
Mr. Khanna?
I vote yes.
Mr. Khanna?
Oh.
Mr. Mfume? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib?
Madam Chair, how am I recorded? This is Mr. Cooper.
You are not recorded. So, Mr. Cooper is not recorded, correct?
Correct.
Okay,
Mr. Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye.
Could I just clarify, Madam Chairwoman? The motion before us is a motion to adjourn. Is that correct?
Right, it is a
Mr.
motion to
Cooper votes
adjourn.
no.
Mr. Cooper votes no.
Yeah, sorry.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Khanna?
I vote no.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Mfume? Ms. Acacia-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib? Ms. Porter? Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush? Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Mr. Welch? Ms. Wasserman Schultz is not recorded. Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear?
Spear votes no.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes no.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes no.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Desagne?
Desagne votes no.
Desagne votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez? Ms. Presley? Mr. Quigley? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan? Yes. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Gosar?
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes yes. Ms. Fox? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions?
Yes.
Mr. Sessions votes yes. Mr. Keller? Yes. Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Meese? Mr. Franklin? Mr. LaTurner? Mr. Fallon? Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes yes.
Ms. Harrell votes yes. Mr. Donalds? Mr. Donalds votes yes. Chairwoman Maloney?
No.
Ms. Maloney votes no.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Ms. Acacia-Cortez is not recorded.
I vote no.
Ms. Acacia-Cortez votes no.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Mr. Quigley is not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Quigley votes no.
Madam Chair, how is Dr. Fox recorded?
Dr. Fox is not recorded.
Madam Chair, how is Talib recorded?
Dr. Fox votes aye. Ms. Talib is not recorded.
Talib votes no.
Ms.
Gomez
Talib
is not recorded.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Madam Chair, how is Presley recorded?
Ms. Presley is not recorded.
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no.
Madam Chair, how is
Fallon recorded?
Mr. Gomez is not recorded. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez votes no.
Mr. Gomez votes no.
Is Fallon recorded?
Mr. Fallon is not recorded.
Fallon votes no.
Is LaTurner recorded?
Mr. Fallon votes aye. Mr. LaTurner is not recorded.
LaTurner votes aye.
Mr. LaTurner votes aye.
Is Mr. Welch recorded?
Mr. Welch is not recorded.
Mr. Welch votes no.
Mr. Welch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
We disagree. I think the opportunity of the infrastructure bill incentivize.
The clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, we have 14 ayes and 24 nays.
The motion is not agreed to. I now recognize
Madam Chair.
myself. I now recognize myself.
I have a parliamentary inquiry.
The inquiry?
Yes, a parliamentary inquiry. We now realize that you can't table a motion to adjourn. So we had a motion to adjourn before the passage of the previous bill. Does that impact, since we're learning as we go here, does that impact at all the vote that we cast previously that we didn't follow parliamentary procedure for?
What's the matter with the guy's question?
Madam Chairwoman, parliamentary inquiry?
Not a proper parliamentary inquiry, but however, we do not believe that this impacts the passage of the bill.
What do you base that on, please? How to make that decision? I mean, it appears we're making rules as we go here.
Not timely raised. I now recognize myself.
Not timely.
The
I raised it as soon as
would
we
clarify
finished
and
it.
strengthen requirements about who can serve as an acting official when a Senate-confirmed position is vacant. The current law has many provisions that are unclear, creating loopholes that are ripe for abuse. Though administrations of both parties have relied and sometimes over-relied on acting officials, the Trump administration's use of acting officials was unprecedented. For example, President Trump appointed at least 30 acting cabinet secretaries, more than any of his predecessors over the last 4 decades. President Trump actually appointed more acting cabinet secretaries, 30, than Senate-confirmed cabinet secretaries, which were 24. The Accountability for Acting Officials Act would lower the time limit for acting officials, such as acting cabinet members and other agency heads, to 120 days instead of 210 days, while still providing additional time when the Senate is considering a nomination. In addition, the bill would limit who can serve as an acting official, requiring a first assistant, generally the deputy at an office or agency, to have been in their position prior to the vacancy. The bill would also require acting officials to testify regularly before Congress require faster reporting to Congress when a vacancy occurs and arises, and close loopholes that allow the President to appoint acting officials without experience in the agencies that they lead. This bill is an important set of reforms endorsed by numerous good government groups and experts from across the ideological lines. I thank Congresswoman Porter for introducing this legislation, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Conley, you are now recognized.
Thank you. Just briefly, I want to commend my colleague from California and the vice chairman of our subcommittee for this important piece of legislation. I heard the criticism that this would somehow impede on the prerogative of the executive to appoint people of his or her choosing. But what Ms. Porter is trying to address is to make sure that the people who are chosen are competent and qualified. And what we, in recent experience, unfortunately, we saw lots of people who were not. And, you know, the federal government needs competent, qualified professionals to help run this massive enterprise on behalf of the American people. I commend my friend, Ms. Porter, for a thoughtful piece of legislation and look forward to supporting it. I yield back.
Madam Chair.
The question now occurs on
Chair.
the amendment. Gentleman seeks recognition. Who seeks recognition?
I do, ma'am. Biggs.
Mr. Biggs.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. I oppose this bill. The Trump administration has been bandied about as the rationale for this bill. What happens in reality is this is a partisan response to partisan problems in getting appointees nominated and accepted by the entire body in the Senate. But it's also more over, it's an intrusion, quite frankly, into the processes of the executive branch who wants to appoint their people. That's really what this is about here, is inserting and injecting legislative control over that. I'm afraid it's going to result in partisan interference. I mean, the last thing I would assume that you would want the Biden administration to have to deal with is Republican interference in his appointment of his nominees. And so I have to oppose this bill and encourage my colleagues to do so as well. And with that, I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield my time to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Porter.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Comer expresses that the President has a constitutional duty to appoint people to the executive, and that is certainly correct. But his duty, any president, regardless of party's duty, is not just to stick a fresh face willing to carry out the President's policy into these important government positions. It is to appoint and to nominate a qualified person, and the Constitution equally puts a duty on the Senate with regard to these executive roles to consider these positions and to vote. The argument that this is an intrusion into executive processes, I think, misunderstands the important residual constitutional duty on Congress to conduct oversight of the executive. We, as Congress, can pass laws and must pass laws to make sure the administration, any administration, Democratic, Republican, any administration, the current and future ones, are engaging in an executive action process for appointments that allows us to conduct our constitutional oversight responsibilities. And I know how seriously my colleagues on the other side of the aisle take those oversight responsibilities. So one of the things that this bill would do is to shorten the time for service for an acting department head from the 210 days in the Federal Vacancies Reform Act to 120 days. And that maintains flexibility for further service when a nomination is pending before the Senate. But it does not allow the President to avoid doing his constitutional duty of putting this before the Senate and allowing the Senate to consider. When there is an acting official in place, and my colleagues are correct that sometimes acting officials will be necessary, what this bill does is require that those acting officials testify at least once every 60 days before Congress, before the relevant committees of jurisdiction, so that we can conduct our constitutionally required oversight. So this bill, this amendment to the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, is designed to address and strengthen the historic bipartisan concern of Congress that we have a constitutional obligation to do appropriate oversight of executive officials and to make sure that executive officials nominated or appointed and not yet confirmed by the Senate are qualified, are experienced, and are free from conflict. And that's exactly what this bill does. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Who else recognizes you? Mr. Dobson is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, this is a bad bill, very simple, very straight to the point. First of all, this bill is a violation of separation of powers. The President has the authority to appoint, even if it's in a temporary capacity, whoever the President chooses to appoint. It is not the role of Congress to put prerequisites on political appointees. The Senate has the ability, through advice and consent, to vote down the nominee by the time it gets to the Senate. But that's the Senate's purview. The House has no role in this. If this committee wants to actually engage in oversight, let's engage in oversight. Let's do it all the time. But let's not play this Monday morning quarterback stuff with President Trump's nominees, which is basically what this is about. If you want to take a look at the current appointees, let's do that. If you want to look at what the President's currently doing right now, let's do that. But to sit here and say that we're going to tell the President, any President, no matter what party you're from, that you can only appoint somebody who had a year's worth of experience in that federal agency, to me, is a gross violation of the President's rights and duties to actually staff the executive branch. Now, I will also say this. If Congress, especially this committee, wants to go through the process of actually beginning to take back a lot of the congressional powers that this House and the Senate collectively have given over to the executive branch, let's do that. I'm all for it. Let's bring all the bills and start pulling back federal powers that should actually reside in Congress. But the one power we don't have, especially in the House, is to tell the President who and who he cannot appoint, or she for that matter, based upon their level of service in a federal agency. Every president has that ability. They have that right. They are duly elected by the people of this country. It is not Congress's job to tell any president who they can or cannot staff. It's definitely not the House's. The Senate can vote those people down, but that's where it stops right then and there. We should actually continue to follow the Constitution, not usurp it with this bill. This is a bad bill, and everybody should vote no.
Madam Chairwoman.
Mr. Conley.
Move to
Madam
strike.
Chair.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I think we just heard from the gentleman from Florida one of the most extraordinary abrogations of the role of the legislature I've ever heard. Apparently, Article 1 of the Constitution does not apply. Apparently, only Article 2 applies, and those powers are apparently close to unlimited. It is the prerogative, indeed the duty, of the legislative branch under Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States, read the Federalist Papers, to circumscribe the powers of the executive. And in fact, it is absolutely within our prerogative to circumscribe the powers that are associated with the executive in terms of appointive powers. We give him broad latitude, but not unlimited latitude. And that's what I just heard from our colleague from Florida. I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. And someday, my friends on the other side of the aisle, if they go down that road, may live to regret it. Ironically, Ms. Porter's bill, if it were applied today, the key example, I believe, Ms. Porter, would be at OMB. We don't have an OMB director. We have a deputy who's acting. And in fact, this would apply to her, a Biden appointee, not a Trump appointee. But we need to be sort of partisan blind when it comes to these kinds of issues. But the idea that separation of powers means unlimited power for the executive, to me, is a very dangerous road to go down, and one that is not borne out by the Constitution of the United States.
Would the gentleman yield?
Or the history, and I would gladly yield to my friend from Maryland.
But I want to thank Mr. Connolly for that really excellent intervention in the conversation, which has taken a remarkable turn. I understand Ms. Porter's bill to be a vindication of the separation of powers. I mean, have we lost so much institutional self-awareness and self-confidence that we don't understand that Congress is the primary branch of government? There's a reason we're in Article 1. We are the lawmaking branch of government. The president's job is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And if a president decided under this extremist unitary executive theory that he just wanted to have acting cabinet officials and acting directors all over the government, then these people would say, yeah, go ahead, he can do it. That's up to the president. And it's hard to think of a greater betrayal of the real constitutional design than that. So I'm thrilled that Ms. Porter's legislation is restoring the proper balance of power and making sure that the president is taking care that the laws are faithfully executed and not circumventing the Constitution and the proper role of the Senate in advising and consenting and passing upon executive branch appointments. So the idea that the House has nothing to do with it, again, cuts against centuries of understanding of the role that bicamerally the House and the Senate play together in terms of defining the functions of the executive branch of government. Again, we are the lawmaking branch. And the Article 1 establishes our broad power to regulate commerce domestically and internationally, to declare war, to impose taxes, budgets, on and on and on. The president's core job is to take care that the laws that we pass are faithfully executed. And the last administration completely distorted the constitutional design to the point where we had a president of the United States saying he would not cooperate with any oversight requests.
So
He would not comply with any of our document requests, and he wouldn't send anybody to testify.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Raskin, if I could ask you a question.
Yes, by all means.
To your point, for example, the separation of powers. So if a president wants to create a new cabinet position, does that president need to come to Congress to get legislative statutory authority to do so?
I mean, traditionally, that's how it's always been done.
Correct. Thank you.
So, look, the constitutional design is such that the legislative branch establishes the basic functions of the executive government, and the president takes care that the laws are faithfully executed. The idea that the president can just do whatever he wants is a myth and a hangover from the last administration. And, you know, any constitutional law expert will tell you that is not the constitutional design. Ms. Porter's superb legislation is an effort to rein in this ideological crusade, which says a president who wants to avoid the law can just appoint a bunch of acting people and they can go out and do whatever, you know, that president wants for the next 4 years. I yield back, and I thank the distinguished gentleman from Virginia for yielding.
I thank my friend.
Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. An additional problem with all of this, and I'm trying to go back kind of on the top of my head here and pull some things together, but Chairman Connolly actually highlighted a further addition, a problem to this bill on July 13th when he wrote a letter to President Biden regarding the Federal Housing Finance Agency, where there was some alleged criminal activity going on with the head there. But interestingly, their top two deputy inspector generals also were implicated in that whole problem. And what this bill would do would require someone who's implicated in a potential crime to replace. I mean, that's we've got to give freedom to the executive branch to do their job. There are always unintended consequences when we start putting forth legislation that there's always a possibility for other scenarios to come up that we can't possibly think through all of it beforehand. And Chairman Connolly, I think, brought up a good example of how this could be used in a wrong way. And with that, I'd like to yield back some more time to the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Heiss. I will state my objection again. There is nothing in the Constitution that states that the House has prerogatives about putting prerequisites on who the president should actually be allowed to appoint to a cabinet position. Period, full stop. Secondarily, if we're concerned about actually making sure that the president faithfully executes the laws of our nation, look no further than the southern border, folks. We got major problems down there. It doesn't look like they're being faithfully executed.
Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair?
Question, yes.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Mr. Raskin is now recognized.
Well, I wanted to respond to that last point, which is interesting to me because it cuts against the entire history of the federal civil service, which is a creation of both the House and the Senate under our lawmaking power. And so on that theory, the entire civil service would be unconstitutional because the House of Representatives would have acted illegitimately to put its imprint on job requirements at every level of the executive branch of government. So please explain what I'm missing there. And I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Florida or anybody else who can explain why on that theory the whole civil service wouldn't be unconstitutional. Okay, I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman made, we are fortunate to have a professor of constitutional law with us, Mr. Raskin. Thank you for your statement. And the president has a constitutional point to appoint, but the Senate has the responsibility to confirm. Yet he appointed more people than the Senate even confirmed. I support the gentlelady's legislation. I think it's important. The question now occurs on the amendment and the nature of the substitute offered by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, request a roll call.
A recorded vote. Pardon me?
Oh, is the ANS? I'm sorry. I'll save that up. I'll save that one, Madam Chair.
The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2994 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have
Madam
it,
Chair.
and the bill is agreed to.
Recorded vote request.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Okay. We now call up 4448, the Administrative Law Judge Competitive Service Restoration Act. The clerk will report the bill,
Madam
which
Chair,
was distributed in advance.
I raise the question of consideration.
You raise a question on the consideration.
Yes,
Bill?
Madam Chair.
Okay.
Look at you, using all the
Raise it.
tabs right. Come on.
I did. It's not debatable.
The bill that we are calling up is not debatable?
No, the question of consideration is non-debatable.
What is this?
He's raised a point of question. The question is the question of consideration.
The question is on the consideration of the bill. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
Okay, yeah.
No.
The ayes have it.
Request a roll call.
A roll call is called. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Madam Chair, just for clarification of what we're voting on, a matter of consideration is, do we wish to consider the bill you've called?
Yes.
Thank you.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Mfume? Ms. Ocasio-Cortez? Ms. Tlaib? Ms. Porter? Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear?
Ms. Spear, aye.
Ms. Spear votes aye.
Kelly, aye.
Ms. Kelly?
Aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence? Mr. Desagne? Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley? Mr. Quigley? Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Gosar?
No.
Mr. Gosar votes no. Dr. Fox? Dr. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions?
No.
Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde?
No.
Here.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin? Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon? Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds? Mr. Donalds votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
How is Talib recorded?
And how is Welch recorded?
How is Lawrence recorded?
I'm going to go down the list. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Khanna?
I vote no.
Mr.
Wait,
Khan-
yes, 1 second. I vote yes. Vote yes.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume? Ms. Acacia-Cortez? She dropped off. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes aye.
Ms. Talib votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Wait a minute, wait. Lawrence vote aye.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. Desagne?
Desagne votes aye.
Mr. Desagne votes aye. Ms. Presley? Mr. Quigley? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Grothman?
Say it again.
Can you hear me? No.
Mr. Grothman votes no.
Okay, can I go back then?
Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Ms. Mace? Mr. Franklin?
Immigration, which is huge, and it's the full amount for the 5.5 million immigrants, which is enormous. Climate is difficult to suss out.
Are there other members wishing to vote?
And of course, Medicare expansion.
Please mute. I would ask members please to mute.
Not in the presence of
Is there anyone else wishing to vote?
working on the
Yes.
Hearing and
House-
seeing none, the clerk
yes,
will
yes,
report
yes,
the
yes. Hello?
vote.
Hello,
Wait, who seeks to vote?
Representative Presley. How have I been recorded?
Ms. Presley, how do you vote?
Yeah. Yes.
Ms. Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley has to turn her camera on.
Ms. Presley, you need to turn your camera on.
Presley votes aye.
Can we see Ms. Presley?
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye.
Is there anyone else wishing?
Mr. Chair, how am I recorded?
Mr. Sarbanes.
Mr. Sarbanes is recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Ms. Fox, Dr. Fox, do you seek to vote? Dr. Fox votes no.
She's already recorded.
Is there anyone else seeking to vote? Seeing and hearing none, the clerk will report the vote.
On this vote, we have 21 ayes and 15 nays.
Motion is not agreed to. I mean, the motion is agreed to, excuse me. I'm sure.
Clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance, H.R. 4448.
H.R. 4448 to restore administrative law judges to the competitive service and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4448, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and thank you for bringing up my bipartisan bill, H.R. 4448, the Administrative Law Judges Competitive Service Restoration Act. Approximately 2,000 administrative law judges currently serve in agencies across the executive branch, adjudicating administrative proceedings that affect critical issues like labor relations, public health, Social Security benefits, and national security. For decades, ALJs were previously hired through a competitive service appointment process that was administered through the Office of Personnel Management. Because this process was run by an agency that was considered independent of the hiring agency, it helped to ensure that the pool of available ALJs was both qualified and impartial. In July of 2018, however, Executive Order 13843 removed them from the competitive service and placed them into the accepted service outside of the reach of normal hiring and employment protections and not subject to requirements for minimum qualifications. This change to the ALJ appointment process stemmed from an inaccurate interpretation of the Supreme Court's decision in Lucia versus Securities and Exchange Commission. It exposed the impartial judges that determine the outcomes of disputes regarding labor relations and claims for Social Security and public health benefits to political influence, degraded the quality of work ALJs do, and undermined faith in vital government programs. For example, a president could now install like-minded ALJs who endorse the administrative decisions of the Social Security Administration, denying disability benefits and thwarting appeals from older Americans who rely on SSA for their livelihoods. The move also circumvents congressional prerogatives and responsibilities under Article 1. In Lucia, the Supreme Court ruled ALJs to be officers of the United States subject to the Appointments Clause of Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. The Appointments Clause specifically requires the President to appoint principal officers, but it authorizes Congress to vest the appointment of inferior officers as they think proper in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of department. Importantly, ALJs are considered inferior officers. Congress, therefore, has a critical role to play in responding to the Supreme Court's decision in Lucia. The ALJ Competitive Service Restoration Act of 2021 is a bipartisan bill that would establish ALJs as members of the competitive civil service who are appointed by the heads of executive departments or agencies and who meet minimum qualifications. Such qualifications include a license to practice law in the United States or its territories and 7 years of applicable experience adjudicating administrative law. The ALJ Competitive Service Restoration Act would ensure that federal administrative law judges have the acumen and impartiality needed to rebuild trust in federal agencies and provide individuals a fair opportunity to appeal agency determinations. The International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers and 23 other organizations have endorsed this bill. I'd like to thank my partner, my Republican partner, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, who is the original co-sponsor with me on this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There are roughly 2,000 administrative law judges across the federal government. These officials play an important role serving as judges and rendering decisions in the administrative adjudications of various federal agencies. This bill would require administrative law judges, also referred to as ALJs, be placed within the competitive service for hiring purposes. This legislation directly overturns Executive Order 13843 signed by President Trump in 2018. That executive order was issued in the wake of a 2018 Supreme Court decision ruling that ALJs are subject to the Constitution's Appointments Clause. Consistent with the court's decision, the order removed ALJs from the competitive service and placed them in accepted service. This was a sound policy decision. By placing ALJs in the accepted service, the executive order gave federal departments and agencies greater flexibility to assess prospective ALJ candidates. This was a smart government reform. Agencies should be allowed to consider ALJ candidates in a timely manner, free from the complexities and delays of the competitive service process. Placing ALJs in the accepted service ensures agencies can choose qualified candidates that will fully meet the unique needs of each agency. All future presidents should be able to provide agencies with the same discretion of the former administration. For these reasons, I oppose the bill. But I'm also opposed to advancing this bill for procedural reasons. At the start of this Congress, the House adopted rules that require committees to hold a hearing on a bill before it is reported to the House. To date, there has not been a hearing on this bill. To ensure this committee is thoroughly and thoughtfully considering each piece of legislation, we need to follow the processes of the House. This is especially important when advancing legislation which would have such a meaningful government-wide effect on federal agencies. We need to have a legislative hearing on this bill before moving it forward. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Seeing none, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I thank Chairman Conley for introducing H.R. 4448, the Administrative Law Judge Competitive Service Restoration Act, which would reverse Executive Order 13843 issued by the previous president. The executive order removed administrative law judges, known as ALJs, from the competitive service and converted those positions to the accepted service. This executive order was one in a string of attempts by the previous administration to undermine the civil service and eliminate workplace protections by making it easier to remove federal employees viewed as insufficiently loyal to the president. The action effectively politicized ALJs, who are intended to make rulings free of partisan pressure. Many federal agencies depend on the decisions issued by the 2000 ALJs, including the Social Security Administration, Department of Labor, and SEC. This bill would reverse the damage the previous administration did by establishing hiring standards for ALJs, including professional licenses to practice law and a minimum of 7 years of relevant experience. The head of an executive agency would hire ALJs from candidates that the Office of Personnel Management has concluded have met the necessary requirements. It reestablishes the previous system, restoring ALJs to the competitive system and service. Where appropriate, any ALJ that is currently part of the accepted service will be converted back to the competitive service. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this vitally important bill, and I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The question, seeing none, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4448 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Okay. And H.R. 3. I now call up H.R. 3533, the Federal Career Opportunities in Computer Science Work Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 3533, to establish occupational series for federal positions in software development, software engineering, data science, and data management, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3533, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as the base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill. Mr. Welch is. So I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. The bill would require the Office of Personnel Management to update or establish occupational series for federal government positions in software development, software engineering, data science, and knowledge management. The final report of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence stated, and I quote, "The artificial intelligence competition will not be won by the side with the best technology. It will be won by the side with the best, most diverse, and tech-savvy talent," end quote. This bipartisan bill will ensure that federal employees will be able to spend a career performing meaningful work in cutting-edge technology fields within the federal government. This is an important step in helping federal agencies recruit, hire, and retain top technical talent. I urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In a world that relies on digital technologies, the federal government needs to be able to hire and attract the right talent. Yet the federal government's current recruiting efforts related to computer technologies too often focus on research and development skills and not enough on practical applications of that specialized knowledge. The ability to recruit and retain qualified software and data professionals is increasingly important, particularly as our government and private sector must withstand more frequent and sophisticated cybersecurity threats. The National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence released their final report earlier this year and found that, quote, "digitally talented people should be able to reasonably expect to spend a career performing meaningful work focused on their field of expertise in government," end quote. The report goes on to recommend that new federal career fields in digital technologies be established by creating new civilian occupational series for software development, software engineering, knowledge management, and data science. We talk a lot on this committee about the need to modernize the federal government and help improve citizen services. H.R. 3533 would help do that. The bill requires the Office of Personnel Management to either update existing occupational series or create new ones to ensure that the federal workforce represents current specialized fields needed for a modern 21st century government.
What?
Currently, the federal agencies can only hire for computer science, computer engineering, and information technology management. This does not adequately capture a modern government's needs or reflect the expanding private sector fields in IT and data. H.R. 3533 will enable the federal government to better target recruiting and retaining qualified professionals in these essential fields. I encourage my colleagues to support this smart bipartisan bill, and I yield back.
Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Welch is now recognized. Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This bill, as you know, directs the OPM to create occupational series for computer science related positions. It includes software engineer, software development, and also data science and data management. And it has to do that within 9 months. As you know, based on recommendations from the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, a report they did, which the Oversight Committee held a hearing on, there are real issues about retention, skill development, continuing education, and the limited pool of candidates. So this is important, obviously, to all of us. So the federal government, we all know, has to do more to recruit and retain software and data science experts. this is going to become an increasingly challenging problem. I introduced HR 3533 with Representative Jay Obernolte from California, and I really appreciate his participation and leadership on this. And it does direct this legislation, OPM, to create occupational series for software engineering, software development, data science, and data management within 9 months. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Seeing no one else seeking recognition, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 3533 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. I now call up H.R. 4393, a bill to require the directors of the Courts, Services, and Offender Supervision Agency of the District of Columbia and the District of Columbia Pretrial Services Agency to reside in the District of Columbia. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 4393 to require the Director of the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency for the District of Columbia and the Director of the District of Columbia Pretrial Services Agency to reside in the District of Columbia.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4393, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as a base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes. Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, and I thank you for marking up my bill today. This bill would require the directors of 2 federal agencies, the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency for the District of Columbia, known as CISOSA, and the Pretrial Services Agency for the District of Columbia, known as PSA, to reside in the District of Columbia during their terms. Residency requirements for certain government positions are found in federal law, DC law, and the laws of jurisdictions throughout the United States. The primary reason such laws exist is so that government officials have a connection to the residents they serve and in-depth knowledge of the unique issues and challenges faced by those residents. CISOSA and PSA are federal agencies that focus exclusively on the District of Columbia. CISOSA supervises offenders on probation, parole, and supervised release under DC law. PSA makes recommendations regarding pretrial release and supervises defendants for the Superior Court of the U.S. and the U.S. District Court for the district. The directors of CISOSA and PSA should be required to be DC residents since they serve only DC. While current directors of these agencies do not live in DC, the bill would not apply, and I repeat, would not apply to directors in office upon enactment. Congress has justifiably required that certain federal officials live in the jurisdictions to which they are appointed, including U.S. District Court judges, U.S. Marshals, and U.S. attorneys. Similarly, Congress, which controls the local DC court system, has justifiably required local DC judges and members of the DC Judicial Nomination Commission and the DC Commission on Judicial Disabilities and Tenure to reside in the District of Columbia. There is no reason that the directors of CISOSA and PSA, federal agencies that uniquely serve DC residents, should not also be required to live in the district. These officials need to be part of the community they serve. A residency requirement for these federal officials will lead to better outcomes in the criminal justice system and is a matter of fairness to DC residents. I urge my colleagues to support this bill.
The gentlelady yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Comer is now recognized.
Thank you. This bill amends federal law and the D.C. Code to require the directors of the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency and the Pretrial Services Agency to live in the District of Columbia. Currently, the Director of the Court Services is nominated by the President, and the Director of the Pretrial Services is selected by an executive committee. It's true that residency requirements are not an unusual thing for many positions in the federal government. It's also true that certain D.C. officials are already required to live within the district. However, we must ask whether this is always a good policy to pursue, and I believe in this case that it is not. These are not local D.C. government agencies, but functions of the federal government. That's because the court services and the entire judicial branch of the D.C. government are, in fact, funded by the federal government and have been since the 1990s. This amounts to over $250 million every year paid for by American taxpayers. And even during our hearings on D.C. statehood, no one advocating for D.C. to become a state could identify how that $250 million was going to be paid for by D.C. alone going forward as a hypothetical independent state. When D.C. takes full responsibility for paying for these court services, I think it will be more appropriate to consider such reforms. As of now, however, the argument to require these officials to live within the district is not very convincing to me. It's not good government for the vibrancy of D.C. It's not good for the vibrancy of D.C., the well-being of the country, or federal employees to be required to live away from the rest of the country. People living in the broader D.C. metropolitan region, which includes Mr. Raskin and Mr. Conley's constituents, are no less capable of serving in the federal government than if they were required to move a few miles closer to the capital. I'm hard-pressed to identify a problem that this legislation solves. I therefore recommend a no on this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I'd like to be clear that DC is intending and fully capable of paying for all services. Once we get statehood, and we're on our way to statehood, we've already had a hearing in the Senate. The House has approved this bill. So the concern about paying for is not relevant. There are districts which are smaller than the districts, which have smaller populations. The district is quite capable of paying when it becomes for all of its services. The reason I'm here is because the district does not yet have statehood. And so this matter is still under the jurisdiction of the Congress.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? I now recognize myself, seeing no one else asking for recognition. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Officials who exercise authority over a jurisdiction and its population should live among the population. This is not a unique idea. Many federal, state, and local positions have requirements that office holders live in the jurisdiction in which they work. U.S. attorneys, U.S. marshals, U.S. district court judges, and more are all required to live where they work. H.R. 4393 simply follows federal precedent and requires that the directors of the Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency and the Pretrial Services Agency for D.C. live in the district. I want to thank Ms. Norton for introducing this important bill. I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back. Who else seeks recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4393 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to.
That is for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote is so ordered. And pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 and Committee Rule 5B, proceedings on the amendment are postponed. I now call up H.R. 4469, the AI in Counterterrorism Oversight Enhancement Act. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 4469 to amend the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 to strengthen the ability of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board to provide meaningful oversight and governance related to the use of artificial intelligence technologies for counterterrorism purposes and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4469, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the amendment. I urge my colleagues to support the AI and Counterterrorism Oversight Enhancement Act. I introduced this bill along with my colleagues, National Security Subcommittee Chairman Lynch and Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee Chairman Raskin. This bill is a meaningful step in maintaining trust in the work of executive agencies. As we all know, privacy and civil liberties concerns are always top of the mind with the emergence of new technologies. We want to ensure that agencies have all the tools they need to execute their functions while also protecting the rights of Americans. This bill would strengthen the ability of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board to conduct oversight and governance related to the use of AI technologies for counterterrorism purposes by executive branch agencies. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Board is the only independent executive branch agency specifically established to protect Americans' privacy and civil liberties. This bill is the product of a recommendation from the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which called for this reform in order to uphold the democratic values of privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights, and uses of AI for national security. The bill would also require the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board to perform a self-assessment of any change in resources or organizational structure that may be necessary to carry out the requirements of the Act. I will offer a substitute amendment that will set a 180-day deadline for this self-assessment from the date of the bill's enactment and will delay implementation of the board's expanded oversight functions to 1 year from the date of the bill's enactment. This amendment will allow time for completion of the self-assessment to inform congressional action necessary to meet the other requirements of the bill. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back. I also ask who seeks recognition. Mr. Comer, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Artificial intelligence has the potential to enhance our nation's ability to combat terrorism at home and abroad. Our defense, intelligence, law enforcement, and homeland security agencies collect enormous amounts of pertinent data for counterterrorism and homeland security purposes. This necessitates the use of AI to augment and empower human analysis and decision-making. That said, with much promise comes great responsibility. As AI becomes more prolific and widely used by our government agencies, it's important for Congress to ensure that the development and use of AI systems are subject to reasonable privacy, oversight, and controls. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board is an independent executive branch agency responsible for ensuring that authorities used to protect the nation against terrorism are appropriately balanced with privacy and civil liberties. The National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence recommended that the board be given visibility into AI systems before they are fielded in our national security and intelligence agencies. This smart expansion of privacy and civil liberties oversight board's authority is what H.R. 4469 attempts to do. In working with Mr. Lynch on this legislation, we understand that the legislation will focus the board's trained oversight capabilities on AI systems developed and used by the federal government in keeping with the board's existing authorities. Expanding the board's authorities to police private sector technology is likely not the right approach for this legislation, and I believe the text we are considering here today stays within those parameters. Additionally, any expansion of the board's mission and duties must be evaluated in the context of the agency's rather limited resources, personnel, and current lack of a fully composed board. Madam Chairwoman and Mr. Lynch, given the critical work of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, I would also request that, as we work together to advance this legislation, the Oversight Committee hold a briefing with the current board to make sure that its original mission is being fulfilled. I think we need to make sure its original mission is being met as it gains additional responsibilities. I support this legislation's goal to ensure proper oversight of AI applications as a potentially valuable tool in our counterterrorism arsenal. The American people depend on Congress to ensure that privacy and civil liberty safeguards are carefully and continually considered with the adoption of any new emerging technology. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4469 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. I now call up H.R. 4470, the Made in America Pandemic Preparedness Act. The clerks will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 4470 to amend Title 41, United States Code and the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to ensure availability of personal protective equipment during pandemics and other public health emergencies through stockpile requirements and domestic manufacturing incentives, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes herself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed electronically to all members in advance. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as the base text for the purposes of amendment. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the amendment. As we enter a post-pandemic world, it is essential that we learn from the trauma of the coronavirus crisis and what it taught us about our national vulnerabilities. Top among those vulnerabilities was a tragic failure of our supply chains that led to catastrophic shortages of medical supplies and personal protective equipment, or PPE, when we needed it the most. A surgeon in California described it as being, quote, at war with no ammo, end quote. A doctor in Kentucky said, quote, not only can I not protect myself, I cannot protect my patients, end quote. Frontline workers in New York City resorted to wearing trash bags as gowns, prompting our garment district to pivot its talent, its factories and resources to the production of PPE for our hospital workers in New York, and they later exported it across America. We must reinvest in the American businesses that made it possible for us to get through the pandemic and who hold the promise of a stronger, more resilient response in the future and in the face of future health emergencies. But the United States continues to rely on fragile global supply chains for PPE and has so far failed to provide American businesses the certainty they need to increase domestic production. We also learned during the pandemic that our allies would not or could not, they could not trade with us. They could not send the supplies to us. Today, China dominates the global market for medical supplies, and it has positioned itself to maintain that dominance even when the pandemic is over. The U.S. must take decisive action to develop our own domestic PPE production, our own capacity, a common sense goal that has bipartisan support in this Congress. During a hearing last year before the Select Subcommittee on the Corona Crisis, the ranking member, Republican Whip Steve Scalise, proclaimed, and I quote, "In the national security interests of the United States of America to bring more of that manufacturing of things like PPE back into this country so that we are not reliant on China or any country in the future," end quote. I couldn't agree more. That's why I introduced the Made in America Pandemic Preparedness Act, a bill to provide market incentives and support to the American manufacturers willing to step up with solutions to create jobs while securing our national supply chains for future resilience. The bill would require that the PPE procure for the strategic national stockpile be made in America, creating an incentive to onshore critical supply chain capabilities and the domestic manufacturing of raw materials that could otherwise be critical choke points with some common sense exceptions. The bill would also require the Congress to receive periodic reports on the nation's PPE supplies and whether those stocks would sustain us through various emergencies, including another global pandemic. In addition, the bill clarifies that the American manufacturing requirement would be applied in a manner that is consistent with our international agreements, including trade agreements. The national security nature of the threat it addresses requires this consistency. Finally, the bill would create a tax credit to level the playing field by helping American manufacturers with the cost of developing and expanding domestic production of PPE. The tax credit could be used for manufacturing technology upgrades, workforce training expenses, and raw materials. We must guarantee an adequate stock of PPE in the strategic national stockpile at all times. We must establish domestic supply chain incentives that put Americans to work, building the skills and materials we need to sustain us when our nation is hit with the unthinkable. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Would the chairwoman yield
Who else
for a
seeks
question?
recognition?
Would you,
Mr. Heiss.
I just wanted to ask if you would yield for a question. I'm just curious if you or the majority staff or anyone has information as to what we have in inventory at this point as a country on all these PPEs and ventilators, all that sort of thing in the event of a, God forbid, another pandemic. Where do we currently stand as a nation before we move forward on a bill like this?
I don't have the specific numbers, but I do know that the prior administration did issue an RFP for local production, domestic production of PPE. I also know that several senators on the Republican side have supported or put in legislation like this, similar to the statements that Leader Scalise has put out. I feel very strongly about it because we were not prepared, and New York led our country in the number of deaths, and part of that was because we did not have appropriate masks, we did not have protective gowns or equipment to protect our people. We were not able to secure it from foreign supply chains, and we were caught without it until our people decided to develop themselves during this pandemic across the country. Men and women started sewing in their homes to just get the equipment out to our our doctors, our nurses, our technicians, our first line people. It was tragic. It was so bad in New York, I started calling everybody I knew in China and Indonesia trying to buy it. We couldn't buy it from foreign countries, and as a result, Americans died.
I think we all...
The future. We all know
sorry.
we're going to have another pandemic at some point, and anything we can do to protect our own domestic supply for these critical supplies, I think, are important. I think the fact that the prior administration had an RFP for supplies from America only to start having a supply chain here in our own country and not dependent on others. I yield back.
Well, thank you, and I just reclaiming my time. I think we all learned from the past experience of how horrible it was. My question is, where do we stand now? I think there is an enormous supply of PPEs. I mean, they're everywhere right now, and I'm just curious to know what type of inventory we have before we move forward on a piece of legislation.
Well, this doesn't require that they start preparing it. It just says that going forward, when the stockpile is depleted, that there should be American supply chain. I will say that in New York, even though we have people that supplied it, they're now buying foreign because it's cheaper. So this is trying to have an incentive that our supply chain in America, that part of it be supplied by American firms so that we're not reliant on foreign countries. Thank you. Who else seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Comer is now recognized.
Madam Chair, thank you for bringing this bill before us today. You know, China caused a global pandemic that has killed more than 600,000 Americans and millions more worldwide. China continues to conceal the origins of this pandemic. China continues to silence, censor, and imprison dissenters. In fact, China, just last week, announced they would not cooperate with any future investigations and continue to blame anyone but themselves and the Wuhan lab's reckless research for this pandemic. We must take affirmative steps to fully investigate the origins of COVID-19 and hold China accountable. We owe it to the families of all those who have suffered for the past 18 months. While I appreciate the Democrats' bill to try to bring PPE supply back to the United States, it's simply not enough. We can and must do more to hold China accountable for their negligence. This pandemic proved that the U.S. government has relied too much on China and other foreign nations for equipment critical to America's success. The Chinese Communist Party took advantage of this and hoarded PPE. In January of 2020, China intentionally lied to the world about COVID-19 and increased their purchases of masks by 278%, gowns by 72%, and gloves by 32%. What did they know then? Did they know it came from the Wuhan Institute there? Did they know COVID was genetically modified? Did they know COVID was designed for human-to-human transmission? Fortunately, President Trump acted swiftly to increase domestic capacity for PPE. He ramped up production for masks, face shield, gowns, gloves, and ventilators. Then through Operation Warp Speed, the Trump administration brought us 3 safe and effective vaccines in record time. Needed vaccines were in arms before January 20th of 2021. This response was unprecedented. Part of this response included strong American companies that stepped up to provide PPE to healthcare workers and all Americans. This work should be heralded. The federal government must act to restock and prepare for any future emergencies, and there are American companies ready to help, many of whom are in Kentucky. We should never rely on China again. I hope to continue working with Democrats to pass more bills to advance American interests, strengthen American ability to counter foreign enemies, and to hold China accountable. Thank you for this legislation, which I support. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4470 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Now we have one final piece of business that I will dispense with very quickly. Pursuant to notice, I call up the following postal naming bills, which were distributed in advance. H.R. 2842, 3539, 3579, 3613, 4030, and 4168. Without objection, the bills are considered read, and I request unanimous consent for their immediate consideration in block. Without objection, all bills are passed there. There being no further discussion or amendments, the committee will recess for 5 minutes before we take recorded votes that have been postponed. The committee will reconvene to take these votes roughly 5 minutes from now. The committee stands in recess for 5 minutes. We will reconvene for votes. The committee will come to order. The question now occurs on favorably reporting 564 as amended to the House. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. What do you say? Okay, the clerk will call the roll. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call a roll.
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume? Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Fume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Ocasio-Cortez votes aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Tlaib? Ms. Porter?
Aye.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Davis?
One second.
Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes aye.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. Desanye? Mr. Gomez?
Gomez votes aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley? Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Quigley?
Quigley votes aye.
Mr. Quigley votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Gosar?
No.
Mr. Gosar votes no. Dr. Fox? Dr. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman?
No.
Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud?
No.
No? Did you get that?
Mr. Cloud votes no. He's up there now. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde?
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace?
Mace votes no.
Ms. Mace votes no. Mr. Franklin? Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
No.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds? Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Chairman, House Davis recorded.
Mr. Davis is not recorded.
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye.
Madam Chair, this is Wasserman Schultz. How am I recorded?
Ms. Wasserman Schultz is not recorded.
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
How is Ms. Talib recorded?
Ms. Talib is not recorded.
Talib votes aye.
Ms. Talib votes aye.
This is Spear. How am I recorded?
Ms. Spear, you are not recorded.
Spear votes aye.
Ms. Spear votes aye.
Sessions would wish to be recorded as no.
Mr. Sessions votes no.
Thank you.
Gibbs. Gibbs like to report it as no.
Mr. Gibbs, we don't see you on camera.
Should I see camera?
Okay. Mr. Gibbs,
I'm on video.
we see you now.
That's it. No. Okay.
Mr. Gibbs votes no.
Madam Chair, this is Mr. DeSaulnier. I would like to be recorded as aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye.
Is there any other member who has not voted? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? Seeing none, the clerk, wait a minute, Mr. Jordan votes no.
Mr. Jordan votes no.
The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 24 ayes and 16 nays.
H.R. 564 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 2994 as amended to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Conley votes aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Ocasio-Cortez votes aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Talib? Ms. Porter?
Aye.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear?
Spear votes aye.
Ms. Spear votes aye. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes aye.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
DeSaulnier votes aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez votes aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley?
Aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Quigley?
Quigley votes aye.
Mr. Quigley votes aye. Mr. Comer? No. Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? No. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Gosar?
No.
Mr. Gosar votes no. Dr. Fox? Dr. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss? No. Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman?
No.
Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud?
No.
Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs?
No. Gibbs, no.
Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions?
Sessions, no.
Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Keller? No. Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? No. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde?
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Ms. Mace?
Mace votes no.
Ms. Mace votes no. Mr. Franklin? Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon? Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds?
Is Fallon recorded?
Do you see him? Mr. Fallon, you are not recorded.
Fallon votes no. Thank you.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Mr. Donalds? Ms. Maloney?
Aye.
Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Ms. Talib
Mr.
recorded?
Ms. Talib, you are not recorded.
Oh, Talib votes aye.
Ms. Talib votes aye.
Is Mr. Lynch recorded?
Mr. Lynch, you are not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Is there any other members who have not been recorded? Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 25 ayes and 16 nays.
H.R. 2994 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. The question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4393 as amended to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton? Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes aye.
Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Conley votes aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Aye.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Khanna?
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Fume votes aye.
Mr. Mfume votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes aye.
Ms. Talib votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes aye.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes aye. Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Spear?
Spear votes aye.
Ms. Spear votes aye. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes yes.
Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
DeSaulnier votes aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez votes aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Ms. Presley? Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Quigley?
Quigley votes aye.
Mr. Quigley votes aye. Mr. Comer? No. Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Gosar?
Gosar, no.
Mr. Gosar votes no. Dr. Fox? Dr. Fox votes no. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Grothman?
No. No.
Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Cloud?
That's it.
No.
Man.
Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Higgins?
Okay, what time? Okay, so we'll have to push this news thing?
Mr. Higgins?
Okay. So
Mr.
when should I
Norman?
do the news?
Will all members please mute? It's difficult to hear everyone's vote.
Mr. Norman? Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller?
Sessions, yes. Sessions, yes.
Mr. Sessions votes yes.
Wow.
Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Clyde?
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Miss Mace?
Mace votes no.
Miss Mace votes no. Mr. Franklin? Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Fallon?
Fallon votes no.
Mr. Fallon votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes no.
Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Donalds? Ms. Maloney?
Aye.
Ms. Maloney votes aye.
Is there any member who has not voted?
How am I recorded, please? This is Ms. Norton.
Ms. Norton, you are not recorded.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Madam Chairman.
Gibbs, how am I recorded?
Mr. Gibbs, you are not recorded.
I'm a no.
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Gibbs votes no.
How is Mr. Sessions recorded?
Mr. Sessions is recorded as yes.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to change that to no, and I apologize for my error.
Mr. Sessions votes no.
Thank you.
Is there any member wishing to change his or her vote? The clerk will report the tally when ready.
On this vote, we have 25 ayes and 16 nays.
H.R. 4393 shall be favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. And with that, there is no further business of the committee. So I want to thank all of you for your participation today, and the committee stands adjourned.